Okay, this is a research seminar and we usually don't introduce the speakers, but I'll do it very quickly in light of the cameras here. We are very happy to have, again, Jim Heckman with us. Jim Heckman has been with the University of Chicago since 1973. Is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor there. He's also professor of law at the law school. And what's particularly important, I'll say a word about this, he's the director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development. I'll say in a moment a word about this. He's still, as you know, extremely active in research, one of the editors of the JPE. Let me note a few of the many awards that he won. He won the John Bates Clark Medal in 1983. The 2000 Nobel Prize, the Jacob Mincer Award in 2005, the Frisch Medal of the Econometric Society in 2014, and last year he was with us winning the 2016 Dan David Prize here at Tel Aviv University. Recently also won a special NIH Merit Award, and the list goes on and on. Let me just say a word about something that I found very fascinating. Just 3 years ago, he founded and he directs in the University of Chicago the Center for the Economics of Human Development. And let me read one statement. The aim of the center is to foster a comprehensive research program that identifies and explores the circumstances under which people develop the skills necessary to thrive in the current economy and achieve their fullest potential. And the work that he'll present today is related to that. On the website of the center, you can find the Heckman equation, which basically says invest, develop, sustain, everything plus. Invest plus, develop plus, sustain equals gain. And I'll distribute, there is a very nice, allow me to distribute the brochure of the center. It's a very nice center that looks like doing very important and socially important research. Well, today's talk is quantifying, in this context, quantifying the life cycle benefits of a prototypical early childhood program.
Okay, thank you. I'll put this on, I guess. And just put it on.
And I'll be passing this.
Here. Oh, down here? Okay. And then just put it in my pocket. It's on? Okay? Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm glad to be back again, and I'm glad you came. So I'll be happy to talk about this work, which is joint work. But let me put it in context, and there is a methodological focus here as well. The question of early childhood fascinates me, and it has many aspects. One is just the development of skill, but another is the measurement of skill. And we have projects doing both. And it's not just early childhood, it's also investments over the whole life cycle. So including returns to education and in both elementary school, secondary school, college, and then on-the-job training. So there's a whole agenda about trying to understand skills and understand that skills are much more than kind of a one-dimensional aspect, which has traditionally occupied the literature. Much more than just IQ, much more than something that's called human capital. But this work also is related to a whole question in economics about randomized controlled trials and how we can use them effectively. And so I want to talk about a structure here where we have a randomized controlled trial of a program, which I'll describe in a minute. It's a prototypical program, so that's why it doesn't quite say, but influential, in the sense that this particular version of the program, intervening with children starting at 8 weeks of age and going through 5 years, a very intensive intervention, 5 days a week for 5 years during the school year. So it's basically a full-time intervention. And some aspects of this program, some of these programs continue even into the summer. So it's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 5 years. It's very intensive. And I'll show you it's also expensive, but it has very big economic benefits. The program itself is a has been imitated or duplicated around the world. So there are versions of this in Australia, in Canada, many different versions of it in the United States, and it's been proposed for many other countries. It's being adapted, I think, in some countries in Europe, although I'm not 100% sure. So, but the goal of this particular paper is to try to understand what the benefits are, and from using and generalizing from an early childhood program. And the problem that I want to describe is, well, we have a randomized controlled trial, relatively small number of observations, so there's always the question about, can you believe the numbers? Are they statistically significant? We've invested a lot of time in that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but in the sense that we have some papers on small sample permutation inference, so that we do not require large sample theory in terms of the econometrics. And what we find is that the large sample theory actually and the small sample exact inference are more or less in agreement. So I'm not really going to talk about that. We have a paper in Science a few years ago showing that. So, but what I want to do is try to ask the question, how can we make good use of this? So this intervention, which was stimulating children, it's checking their health at an early age, it's basically providing them with substitute or at least complementary parenting. These are all disadvantaged children. They're all children living by the measured poverty line in the early 1970s. So this program was an enriched program. It was put in place after Head Start and some of the earlier preschool program was put in place. So it follows in the wake of those programs. But the structure of the program is that it's very rich. It includes in the afternoon play sessions and very intensive. We can actually follow these people. People randomized into the program and randomized out for 35 years. I mean, this is very unusual, so we can actually follow these kids. 35 years of age is pretty good for these programs. It's very long-term follow-up, but it's not the life cycle. You can say, well, if you discount, it's not much of a difference, so you can discount and don't have to worry about the remaining lifetime. But one of the important benefits of this program, it turns out, is actually on health. And actually the benefits in health and sort of the realizations of health come later in life. We have some markers, some indicators in the mid-30s, but the real benefits from health come in the later in life. And so and then there are other benefits as well. Some of the earnings growth is later, although it's concentrated relatively early. So the question then is, what are the long-term benefits of this? And then how do we summarize this program? How do we actually not just make an argument in favor of, but just evaluate it? I'm not making any advocacy statement today. I just want to know, is this a good thing to do, and do we have any evidence promoting it? So the idea is to kind of understand how this program would compete against rival programs in the public sector. And we can imagine a lot of other projects, like building a dam, creating an airport, building a road, and so forth and so on, or investing in weapons or whatever. So computing rates of return sounds like a pretty dull activity, but actually it's interesting and challenging, and that's what I want to do today and show you. So it raises a methodological question of how can we get the most out of social experiments. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about social experiments where people have been arguing, saying the only evidence I believe is from a randomized controlled trial. And there are a lot of people saying that, and it's very influential in some quarters of the United States and I think the world, and in governments. People, there's a slogan, I don't know if you've heard it here or use it in Israel. It's called evidence-based policy. You use that term, and what it means is evidence from a randomized controlled trial, not evidence from all sources. And so I want to talk about using evidence from all sources and how it helps us use it. So I'm not going to throw away the randomized controlled trial, but the randomized controlled trial by itself is not going to be fully informative. So anyway, that's by way of introduction. So let me just start. I just point out that I do have co-authors, and this group here is a group. It's a group called the Schaefer Center at USC. It's headed by Dana Goldman, and these are two of his associates working. And they're primarily looking at health economics. So part of this paper is actually a health economics paper, where we're actually looking at what the benefits were of the study and then how we can evaluate those benefits. So I'm giving you a long-winded introduction, but it shows it. So I want to use economics to explain this program. And I think I'm going to also use, and the goal is to try to use econometric methods as needed to try to supplement the information from the social experiment. So what I want to talk about is then how we supplement this, and then how credible is what we do. So this is not an attack on anybody. And I would just emphasize this bold first bullet, that somewhere in the literature there has been this kind of, people always exaggerate. It's very important, strategically. The Sigmund Freud story? Well, no, the story about the young man who approached Freud and asked how could he be successful in life? And Freud gave one word answer. He said, exaggerate. And we always know that. So I think it's true. So that's all fine if you want to become famous and become so it's good for certain strategic purposes. But here, I really think that the conflict, say, between what is sometimes called causal models associated with RCTs and structural models, to my mind, there's absolutely no conflict. And in fact, here I'm going to try to show the symbiosis. And I would make the other point that I certainly strongly disagree that there's somehow only evidence base is from an RCT. RCTs can be very limited, especially in this area of early childhood, and especially for some of the more recent interventions where we only have the first few years of life. We want to know what's the lifetime consequence, not how we make kids better off in the next 3 years. So what I want to do is talk about it. So here's something from The Blind Man and the Elephant, this fable. And so I just want to talk about this program. This program, you can see, has multiple aspects. And in fact, that's another whole issue, which is that we have many different aspects. So if we're going to look at treatment effects, we would get an entire battery of treatment effects, a whole wall of them. And so which treatment effects to look at? So here I'm just saying, with somewhat whimsically, you could look at some aspects of the program, and here are your different ways you're looking at it. Very expensive is one way that critics talk about. The second way is people say, look, it's invalid because it turned out that the control group of the experiment had substitutes. And by the time this program was in place, there were plenty of other substitutes, including things like Head Start. Another one is that program is too old to be informative, and it's simply saying, well, you can't generalize, and then there's another. So we can look at all these claims. And what I want to try to do at the end of the seminar is answer all these questions. The blinders are removed now, and I want to try to sort of look at these questions, but in a unified way. But I will argue that different methodologies more or less agree, although they do tell us different things. And I'm going to emphasize primarily rates of return and benefit costs, but I am going to look at other methods as well. And I do want to try to convince you that the tax distortion adjusted rate of return on this particular program is 13.7, somewhere between 13 and 14%, very high. And that's literally accounting for the welfare cost of taxation. So it's something that would survive extensive, and it does survive a lot of sensitivity analysis, which I'll talk about. So this is what I want to do. So what are the challenges? Well, first of all, like many of these programs, there are many, many aspects of the program. Health, earnings, crime, special education, which is associated with remediation in elementary school. So there are a lot of different ways. So if I wanted to write 40 papers, I could write 40 papers on each treatment effect, right, or each category. Say, here's the effect on health, here's the effect on earnings, and but I'm a little impatient to try to really understand what the program does, not what it does on one little piece. I will talk about what it does on each of these pieces, but to understand that, you need to understand, I think, all of the pieces. And I'm going to show you that if we only look at one piece, we get a very somewhat distorted view, or at least we underestimate what the real benefits are. But then with multiplicity of outcomes, we need to say, how are we going to value these? How are we going to evaluate these? We have lots of treatment effects. What are we going to say is a good? Here is a more methodological point I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I have earlier work the kind of standard problem that if you have hundreds of treatment effects, scores of treatment effects, and if you just report selectively the best, you're taking an order statistic over a set of data, and the statistic itself is biased. So on average, if you use an alpha percent significance level, then alpha percent of the time in a sample you should find, quote, significant coefficients just by fishing. And everything we're doing here, or at least I'll show you some categories, are really avoiding this idea of cherry picking where you kind of get the best. That's very common in this area, less so for economists, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But then there's the question about going out of the life, do the life cycle. And without going into and just kind of telling you what I'm going to do, how can we go beyond the life cycle? Well, we have auxiliary data. We have lots of data from other panel surveys. Those panel surveys are looking at the life cycles. We have data from the Health and Retirement Survey starting at age 50 and taking people well into their lifetimes. We have data from other data sources that allow us to add, to supplement what's here. But the obvious problem is cohort effects, that these data are older data by definition, right? We have data up to age 35. And to do that, we look at older samples. And we know, at least in the US, that the wage histories and the wage dynamics have changed a lot in the last. So we need, if we're going to make those projections, to take account of the fact that we are using data that's somewhat older. And so there's not going to be an exact solution to that, but there's a range of plausible estimates. The same thing is true about health. There have been a lot of improvements in health, not only in terms of self-administered health and healthier behaviors, but also in terms of medical technology. So that there will be probably, if we project longer, these 35-year-old people when they're 55. Remember the old argument by Posner and Philipson? Anybody remember that book? Or nobody read it? But basically, they argued it's okay to smoke now because by the time you're 50 years old and kind of at risk for smoking, there'll be technologies invented to cure lung cancer. So, so anyway, the point is there are rapid changes in technology. I don't comment. But then the other part is control group substitution, and that could be fatal. We know that in some of these studies, like for example, like in the microfinance studies and development, or some of the health studies, that when people have reported like a given number, say this particular microfinance program or this particular health intervention is really good, they're comparing it against the control group. But the control group may have lots of opportunities. And so what you're really doing is comparing the treatment group outcome for this particular program with the control group, which is the max over all the remaining programs. And it's not the same thing as this versus no treatment at all, which is, for many people, a question of interest. So there are lots of different questions of interest, and I'll define those. So anyway, so these are all what I would consider empirical challenges. And this is what we want to do. I want to try to convince you we can do this in a robust way. What's going to be ugly about this, I'll just be upfront about it, is that, it's not like I can come up with a single number. So I'm not going to tell you. I did give you 13.7, but I'm going to show you a range of estimates. So it's not just 13.7. There are different assumptions that need to be made. You can make those explicitly and do a sensitivity analysis. And I'm going to try to convince you that across most plausible versions of sensitivity analysis, we still come up with range, but with understanding and get some beneficial effects for the program. But I do want to make a point about this so-called substitution bias in the control group, is that if you just take a pure narrow treatment effect saying, well, here we have a randomized controlled trial, it's been contaminated, the control group doesn't work, you wring your hands, you say there are threats to validity. Here what I would argue is we use the non-experimental methods to model the choices people make in the control group, we can actually get a lot of information out of these substitution probes, because we can now compare this to each of those other substitutes that would be selected. And I'll give you an example of that. So what we find, just to summarize, is we find strong effects on health, the quality of life and healthy behaviors, the earnings, reduced crime, higher education, and earnings, employment, and the education of mothers. And it's also the case that the earnings of the mothers. This is a child care program. And whether or not there's a really an obvious and important question about, do you really want to value, what's the value of providing child care, maybe the private market, working efficiently, maybe there's no need to subsidize, but there might be a need to subsidize. And so I'm going to give you calculations including the earnings that mothers make and excluding them, because there is an argument for excluding them, right? That the private market, whatever the market value is of education and the returns, then the earnings would pay for it. So anyway, these are the multiplicity of benefits I was talking about, and this is the range. And instead of reporting the 13.7%, which I was telling you before, this is the kind of range that we're going to find for the benefit-cost ratio. And these are all, quote, statistically significant in the sense that when we do different sensitivity analyses, it's going to range between like 1.5, which is getting close to 1, but still bounded away from it, actually, at least if you use statistical significance as the criterion, up to 17.4. So a lot of range here. And I'm not going to tell you that there's exactly one number. And the range in the internal rate of return is somewhere between 8% and 18%. Question, yes?
Is it possible to separate the part that is monetary or...
Yes, I'm going to do that, exactly. No, that's the point. Instead of my giving you one number and saying, believe me, friend, what I'm going to do is give you probably too many numbers, and you can pick out each of the components. So that's the part that's a little tedious, is to look at the components. So I'm going to disaggregate this component by component. We can value the health. We can value the crime. Crime itself is very controversial. You ask, what are the social costs of crime? It's not the transfer. I steal your watch. It's still a watch. Socially, though, we have the number of watches still in the world. But if I beat you over the head and you have to go to the hospital to get cured, that's a real social cost. So we're going to count only the social costs. But there are lots of different ways to count those costs. And so I'm going to talk about different assumptions. And it's important. And it does affect the estimates. But what I want to try to convince you is that the range of estimates will hold up under what I would consider plausible assumptions. I mean, you can judge these. And so part of it is that I don't want to say this is the truth. Different people will hold different assumptions, and they can actually use what we're doing to relax. So to answer your question, at least to look at crude benefits, overall, this is the cost. Very expensive. It's like $18,000 a year, 5 years. That's in 2014 dollars. So you're getting, actually it should be like 90,000, but the point is they're definitely high costs. This is the discounted value of benefits. Now that's discounted, I think, at 3%. So you can use other rates, but even if you use the 7% number, you're going to get significant, quote, statistically large benefits. So big costs, but huge benefits. So, and then we can break it out into the labor income of participants, the labor income of the mother, crime, health, and then we can further disaggregate it. So that's the kind of category, right? We can sum up each of these components, and hopefully that's what this is. And I'll show you how we break it out and isolate it. So this is the kind of range. I don't want to go through, I'll go through this at the end, but we can get a distribution of what the estimates are. So this is like the mean here for women, the mean for men, but there's a huge range here. That's the distribution under alternative assumptions. So this distribution is a distribution over different procedures. This is not like just a sampling distribution for a particular model. It's going over all models, so it's a different kind of distribution. Okay, and I will try to justify these. But this is the kind of sensitivity analysis that we perform. This looks pretty weird. This is a heart-shaped region and so forth, but it's just a Venn diagram where what we're doing is asking what are the returns if we kind of just look at crime, the benefits for crime alone, and we look at the benefits of health alone, and then we look at the benefits on parental income alone, and then we look at everything together. And so the overlap regions would tell you 2 at a time, 3 at a time, so that we can actually then disaggregate and see just what's sensitive and not. I'll come back to this because you don't know exactly how I got it. But I think some evidence like this is informative, so I'm not going to give you a single number. But another finding, which I probably won't have a lot of time to go into, is on the findings by gender. It's really interesting. There's a whole literature that's out there, emerging now in economics, but it's in psychology, older literature, is that little boys, especially 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, are particularly vulnerable, especially disadvantaged boys. That they are, they're much more prone to violent behavior, aggressive behavior. A lot of that can translate in extremely violent behavior. It's a pretty good predictor of adult violence. But the benefits are somewhat different for these interventions for boys versus girls. And so I want to, I'll discuss these, but they really are significant, not just statistically significant, but important differences. But the one finding that really is most startling, at least in my mind, is that when you take the boy, the little boy, outside the home, outside, so these programs are very high quality. The alternative programs at this point of time were actually fairly low quality. And the reason we know that is that the center that performed this experiment collected information on the quality of the alternative programs. This is all in a single labor market, by the way. It's in the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina area, around North Chapel Hill. And they could actually then collect information on what the alternative centers were. But it turns out that this high-quality program, very beneficial, especially for the girls. When you ask the question, well, how do the boys benefit compared to participating in this program, what you find is that the boys in the low-quality programs, as the alternative group now, seem to be harmed. There's actually a negative effect of being in low-quality childcare. And I think that's an interesting thing. It has some policy relevance, but I don't know if I'll tell you that when we get to it. So I've told you a little bit about the program. It was done in the early 70s. It starts early. There's a prototype of it. There was a second stage, but the second stage was very mild, a very weak intervention, some home visits, but statistical analyses of the second stage of the program. So it's a two-stage randomization, which is interesting. But the second stage had virtually no effect. And when you test for pooling and you look at the point estimates on the pooled sample for those who were in the program or not, and by classifying by whether they were in the program in the first stage, you're finding very, very little difference. Question? Is there questions? Oh, please, ask. I'd rather answer questions than just rant in an unstressed. So I won't give you all it. So the goals were, I will point out this, that in this era, cognitive psychology was supreme. And there was a great faith that IQ was the important goal of raising IQ. I mean, this was an era where people really thought IQ was important. And so the goal was to boost IQ. And I want to show you that in the course of doing that, by actually intervening with the kids, giving them stimulation, reading to them, having them do projects, do dramatic play, pretend you're in counterfactual worlds. I'm going to be your emperor of the universe, or you're the king of England, or something of the sort, or I'm going to be, just imagine that you're a pirate on a ship. Having these kids think of in this kind of counterfactual way and play turns out by itself to be very important. That's studied independently of this. But this is the kind of activity they were doing. And then as the kids got older and approached schooling, they were looking at more academic aspects, like, teaching them the alphabet maybe, and some simple concepts of. And then it had access to health screenings. All of this creates a problem, of course, because you have multiple outcomes and you don't know which of these was effective. I have some other work, I'll talk at the end, ask, if you get rid of, only look at one aspect of these, how well do those compare? But that's a different paper and a different, we'll talk maybe about it in the end. So this suggests the intensity, and it does have subsidized childcare. And that's something that is an interesting byproduct, and it's important. But here is an example of the programs that are based on this. Question, yeah?
The program is one block. I mean, you have either someone was in the program or not, or
yes.
You have ideas of the intervention at 8 weeks to 6 months. Is it maybe without it, the program would be better?
That's a great thing. No, I completely agree, but you can, no. So this is like 5 years, and it turned out that you don't even have a problem that's usually present in these experiments, which is some of the people offered treatment refused, or maybe they dropped out. It turned out the only dropout, the major dropout, was death. Some of these children die. So there's no question about it that there is dropout. And a few of the parents move, but the mobility is low. But there are some of the parents who move. But otherwise, people offered the program, take it, and they generally stay in the program. It's viewed as, just by a reveal preference type argument, they perceive it as being a benefit, and they at least stay with it for the 5 years. But there isn't this kind of partial. For the control group, there is. They have partial benefits, and you can see. I'll show you a graph in a minute. But literally, there isn't. That would be great to do, but we don't have it. Like each week of the program, like 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks.
Even with respect to who the parents are, I would assume that for some parents, it's better that they take care of the kids until 6 months. And maybe for other parents, it's better that they be taken.
I think you're right. It would be great to investigate that. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that question. Some people would say when you take the kid away too early, you're breaking up attachment, and there may well be harm caused by that. I don't know that. I don't think anybody knows that. There are programs that start later, like at 18 months and 34 months, focus on one aspect of the program and have very high benefits. So, I mean, but they also focus on something much narrower than these. So there is a lot of incomparability, yes?
So are you looking at it as a con of the program that it combined everything together? Or in your eyes, perhaps, if it would have been split up, you wouldn't have seen any effect and then you would lose it?
Right now, I can't answer your question. I mean, I only have the package. I mean, I have other programs to break out this, but right now there isn't any variation in the component. Even through, like he was saying, partial participation. Like I go for 5 weeks and stop, or go for 10 weeks and stop. That would have some issues about who are the people who do that and controlling for that, but I don't. And that's a problem, but that's true of a lot of social experiments of this type. You know, people typically do a lot of things at once. And of course, scientifically, that's not what a biologist would do or a physicist. You would kind of focus on one little narrow aspect and control it. But a lot of the social experiments, especially in this area, have it. But there are some cases that are specifically focused on one aspect of what this program does. And if we have time, I'll talk about that. So I'm confident that we can narrow this down to something much less costly. But that's like a different paper. So this program, though, is like being implemented. So it's not like it's irrelevant. So there's a lot of information. This is publicly available. The big issue is what I was saying before. The whole sample is just a little bit over 100 observations. People say, holy smokes, this is nuts. They have rules that, at 100. But then here, this paper in Science, Campbell et al., we actually then compare the inference from exact permutation inference and from large sample theory. And we found, for these data, doing a very, very thorough study, or at least trying to do a thorough study, that the asymptotic theory was giving us essentially the same inference. It was surprising. I didn't expect that. I mean, I really didn't. And it's not universally true. And there is some attrition. Again, I mentioned death was a primary, but there was some moving. Parents moved. And so the adjustments would be using what's called inverse probability weighting, which is a form of matching. I mean, it's just basically adjusting the sample by the probability of staying in the sample. And we do some sensitivity analysis. But the key point for what we do is that everybody offered the treatment accepted it initially. I mean, they accepted it. And so that does change. It makes things much easier, as you'll see. So then here's the problem. The problem is this is the treatment period. It's up to like age 5 for us. We follow these people up through age 34. And then what we really do not have any data on is the rest of the life cycle. So that's the problem. We have to fill that in somehow. But this is the point. There's something called a high-risk index. All these kids are disadvantaged. Their parents are disadvantaged. It's not based on the kids, because the kids are only 8 weeks old. So it's not like they're taking low birth weight babies, or you don't measure IQ very well at age 8 weeks. So it's basically the family environment. But we have measures of those family environments. And we not only have measures of those environments in our sample, in the experiment, but we also have it in the auxiliary samples we're going to use. So we can create counterparts, at least in the risk set. So basically, this is just notation. We have, W is, basically you want to participate in the program. R is you randomized in. So actual participation is just the product of those two. But as I just said already, that W is equal to 1 for everybody offered the program. So more or less, D and R is basically the same. If you're randomized in, you take it. Otherwise, you go to a substitute, which could include the home. So that's just notation. So we can interpret the treatment effects as basically average treatment effects for the population at risk, the ones who are defined to be offered, the ones who were offered the program, those who satisfied, who happen to lie in this calligraphic beta naught set. So we can get then something just because of the participation. Otherwise, we'd have to look at those who actually decided to choose to stay in the program. But it's 100% participation rate among those offered. So then just standard notation here, we look at outcome with treatment, and we look at outcome without treatment. Just in the superscript is telling us which treatment. And there's a vector of this at each age. Lots of outcomes and lots of ages. And we can look at the treatment effect not only within sample, but outside sample. And here's the point that I made earlier about exposure. What we're getting is, if you look at the this is the CDF of this. What you're finding is that about 25% of the kids, these are all control group children, do not stay at home. Their parents never enrolled them. And then you can see, as you go up the fraction of time, the 5-year period, you can see that there's a lot of differences among parents in terms of how much they spend in alternative preschools and when they do. And actually, a lot of the alternatives are taken up around 3 and 4. So that's when many parents start surrendering their kids. In early years, they typically don't. So this kind of contamination, like I say, is sometimes viewed as a problem. I think it's a source of information. And there is a simplification we have. I mentioned there are a little more than 100 observations. And so what we have is we could, in principle, write alternative treatment effects conditional on each length of exposure. The problem with that is we'd run out of data very quickly. So we experiment with different definitions of exposure. But what I'm going to talk about now is those who stayed home all the time versus took any treatment. That's quite a broad range. And then we look at alternative definitions. So it would be nice to do it for the whole interval of exposure, potential exposures, but we simply run out of data. So that's a limitation of what we're doing. But again, we can play and sensitize, look at the sensitivity analysis to see how important that is. So then if we look at just the control groups, we have 2 groups, those who stay at home and those who receive some alternative. Simplification, analytically useful. And then basically we have the same switching regression framework. That among the control group, we have 2 groups, those who participate in some program, alternative, and those who stay at home. And then we have these 2 counterfactuals. And decomposing this is not a consequence of the experiment. The experiment is letting us estimate, well, I'll show you what allows us to estimate. But we could, in principle, randomize. Here it would be much harder to devise a randomization to kind of estimate these counterfactuals. So we are using non-experimental methods. So we're going to model who participates, who doesn't. And we use a variety of different methods. From matching, a very simple method, instrumental variables methods, and some standard selection methods. And we actually find agreement among those methods, although the instrumental variable and selection methods are getting us imprecise estimates. So it's not particularly convincing. So what are the parameters we could estimate? Well, the experiment itself is estimating this thing here. This is this versus the next best. I mean, that's kind of what the local average, that's what the local average treatment effect is actually estimating when you have multiple choices. It's this versus the next best. And so that's what the experiment would estimate. And because everybody's taking W equals 1 is equivalent to my being in this set and offered the treatment, it's equivalent to this. So that's straightforward. That's what the parameter identified by the experiment. And then we could define other parameters. This is my being in the program, the treatment at age A, versus my being not in the program and V equals 0. That's being at home. And I can then estimate that as well. That's a different parameter, which is comparing treatment against one particular alternative state. In principle, if I had a whole vector of states, like the whole line, of the whole fraction of time, I could estimate treatment effects conditional on those. And then a comparable would be saying those who get some treatment in an alternative center. So you need non-experimental methods, and I think that's generally true. Most experimental studies in economics have choices. I mentioned the developmental issue, the development economics issue about the microfinance studies. Most health programs, especially in less developed countries, there are a lot of competing NGOs that are offering these kinds of opportunities to villages and so forth. So you have to be careful about it. We're going to talk. So here's a question. I don't know, how much time do I have? 45 more minutes? Okay, good, actually, it's amazing. So the question is, look, we have all of these treatment effects, and we have treatment effects for each age and for whole blocks of categories. What's the best way to summarize this? So I'll give you 4 different ways to summarize it, and then I'm going to focus on one. The first is this is the more traditional approach, number 1. You look at a bunch of treatment effects, and you usually should organize them by blocks. So look at the effect on health. I can look at health at each age. We have physician visits as the children. I'll show you what those effects are, pretty substantial. So physician visits, and then earnings, employment. So we can create blocks. And then we can do basically hypothesis testing by blocks. And so if you're familiar with it, there's this, I mean, the multiple hypothesis question goes back to old paper by Tukey in the 40s, I guess. But recent methods by, for example, Romano and Wolf and Romano and Shake will adjust in a very simple way for multiple hypothesis testing. So we do multiple hypothesis testing by blocks of interpretable outcomes. That's one way to go. Another way is to say we have all these blocks, but we could extract like principal components or factors within the blocks and test just what is the factor I form over a bunch of outcomes for health, for earnings, and so forth. That's another way to do it. That's a crude summary, but it might be more economical in the sense of doing the data. Third would be combining functions. Now, what are combining functions? If you're familiar with some of the work on meta-analysis, it's a question, if I have inference on a bunch of outcomes, how can I then say what the inference is across all of those outcomes? What's the overall inference I would make? I want to show you at least a couple of combining functions that we look at. But my primary focus is this, benefit cost analysis and rate of return analysis. The great benefit of this compared to these other methods, this is going to give me lots of treatment effects, lots of things to look at, and to be honest, very hard to understand. None of you will remember 1 through 3. You might remember 4, because I'm going to give you one number and a distribution around it. But this also is what's relevant, I think, for public policy when we think about it. It's very boring to do benefit cost analysis in some sense, but it's also very relevant if you're going to be competing with other uses of public funds. Yeah?
So, I mean, it's a related but somewhat different question about relevance for policy. So we have this rather small sample, which is, of course, can deal with the internal validity in all sorts of ways. But then there's a question if there's a small group of kids, maybe, some of the mechanisms involved in this package, which we don't exactly know, was just one great feature, one just great aspect of this intervention that is hard to replicate elsewhere. So, I mean, it raises the question, don't you think that the small sample size, beyond the issues of internal validity, also, in some sense, make it more challenging to make externally valid insights?
No, and that's why, I mean, I'm reporting a result of analysis of one sample, but we are, precisely because of your point, we have multiple samples. They're not exactly the same intervention, but we have different samples with different teachers, and we also have a variety of mediating variables that we can look at. So we can ask the question, and I'm going to rely on this critically, what are the mechanisms producing the treatment effect? So I'm not just going to report a treatment effect. I'm going to tell you what ingredients report this. So it turns out in these particular program, one of the very interesting aspects of this program and many other programs is how they galvanize the parents into more interaction with the child. So if you just look at the internal interaction in the home between the parent and the child, for those who get treatment, the parents seem to be turned on. And that's without your going and lecturing to the parents. The little kid comes home and the kid's very fired up, and the parents get fired up in response to the kids. So that's one mechanism. there are other mechanisms as well, and we try to deal with that. Now, that's crucial to what we're doing, is trying to understand the mechanisms. In fact, this whole forecasting idea, and this is where the structural econometrics comes in, is to try to understand those mechanisms and then to argue, and I'll show you why we need to argue this, that we can use the non-experimental data to replicate treatment effects that could have occurred if we had changed those same inputs. So what I want to do, I mean, just to tell the story directly, is I want to be able to estimate, you can think of as production functions for the treatment effects. And so that's getting somewhere there. But it's still true that the input that I get in this center would be possibly very different. But at least I could cope with that, right? Suppose that I find this particular amount of time that this loving preschool teacher was giving. If I have that time input and I can have some variation, there would still be some variation in those preschool centers, and I do have some variation, that I can at least get an idea of just how much is due to that input and what the level of the input is. So that goes part way towards answering your question. But the support of the function may be still, they could be way out. You're dealing with very, very generous, loving people, and you can't, if I'm way off the support, I'm in trouble. The support conditions will play a big role. So I agree. So these are what we find from the step-down analysis. I'm just going to say this qualitatively. I can show you treatment effects. It's in the appendix, so you're welcome to look at the paper, or there's a paper too, but there's also a handout, and you're welcome to look at this display. It's got a lot of appendices. But these are the results. We find just when you do the step-down block analysis, just taking blocks, you're getting different arrests. So you're finding, for example, that males have many fewer felony arrests. They have better health. They receive higher labor income. They're more likely to be employed. The women are more likely, schooling effects are bigger for the girls, positive effects on their employment, and there's not as much strong effects on female labor income, but there are some through these child care effects. And again, for women, there's less crime. But it turns out for women, the value of the damage caused by female crime is much less. And so the value, the contributor to the cost-benefit analysis is lower. I mean, men can cause more damage. Very few women are murdering, and more men are. So anyway, so here, all these, I could show you this. Many seminars would show you only this, and I'll leave it to your discretion. When we use method 2, just aggregating over these blocks instead of doing step down, we get basically the same agreement. So between 1 and 2, we're getting the same inference, this being the inference, the least crude list of what we're finding. The third is combining functions. And let me just define. The idea is we still have blocks of similar outcomes, employment, health, some concepts that we at least think are comparable. And what we could do is we can define a treatment effect for each outcome at a given age, right? Treatment versus control for individuals who are in the program or are at least eligible to be in the program. We can form this treatment effect. And then we can ask the question, so we have a whole bunch of treatment effects within each block. And you can take the null hypothesis. Suppose you take the null that the program has no effect whatsoever. So if we had lots and lots of outcomes, on average, right, each outcome, if we compute the percentage of outcomes, or the fraction, I should say, the proportion of outcomes in each block, which is, here is the beneficial outcome. So this CL is this object here, over the whole number of treatment effects within the block, the whole number of outcomes within a block. So this is just asking, how often do we get a positive effect? We can also, obviously, the complements the number negative effects and zero effects. Zero won't be important empirically, obviously. But so what we find, and so what we can do is we can compute this. And this gives us a number. And if there's, under the null, that there's no treatment effect, on average, that number should be around a half, right? Half should be positive, half should be negative. It's a random number because it's under the null. So we can count how far we are away from the half, okay? And that's what we do. That's one combining function. Another way to do it is say, no, you're just counting each treatment effect. I mean, this is like, it's like I have a lot of different trials, and I toss the coin on this outcome, I toss the coin here, I toss it here, and say every time it comes up heads, I might not find each one of those is statistically significant. The sequence could actually show out to be significant. So the logic is to try to look at these combining functions and compute. And so basically this is just saying what more precisely what, and this is where I would use the large sample theory, where I would invoke that previous paper saying I can use large sample theory. So this P is going to be distributed asymptotically normal around a half. And I can use that. So I use that here in this part of the paper. And you can use bootstraps to do that. Again, we actually justify the bootstrap. You can also just count significant results. Oh, question, yeah.
Just a small,
Yeah.
CI,
Yeah.
you do assume that all outcomes are of equal importance.
Yes,
Right.
yeah, that's exactly. When you get to the benefit cost analysis, we're going to put a dollar value. But I'm staying within blocks though. So what I'm
I mean, within the blocks,
Yeah.
one can imagine that the various outcomes.
Absolutely.
One may be more important than the other.
Exactly, and here what I could do is just apply weights, right? And people do that in the combining function literature, the whole meta-analysis literature. People are actually applying different weights for precisely that purpose. It could be like keeping the person alive is far more important than delaying the onset of the flu by 1 day or something. So they would weight it. I'm going to come up with dollar weights as my way to do it, but that's a different notion. I'm not counting the number. But yes, there are lots. This is totally arbitrary, but it is another way to think about the program. And so you're absolutely right. I could give you hundreds of weight, whatever your weighting function was. I'm just equally weighting because I don't know what is most important. I mean, none of these actually are counting for death yet. They're too young. Some of them died early on, but not many of them die after they survived the early years. And then you could count significant results and so forth. And here we break it down by males and females. And that's something, there's a recurrent finding that the girls and the boys are really fundamentally different. But here's the benchmark of 50-50, right? It's basically if you toss a coin. And so here, remember, this is asymptotically normal, and we're accounting for the covariance across the outcomes. So there's no issue about dependence in the causes of the coin. We adjust for that. But again, using asymptotic theory. And you can see that for females, if we go over these outcomes, this is across all the outcomes in the experiment now. It's not by block. That you're finding about 80% are beneficial, which is kind of interesting. It's saying I toss the coin on many outcomes, I get a beneficial effect. And I think that's, and for the boys, it's also beneficial from the benchmark of 50-50, but it's also less, but it's also statistically significant, but there are fewer outcomes. So more beneficial outcome for the girls than for the boys. And if we use the significance benchmark, then we're going to find a similar, obviously we change the number, and we find it significant. But, and this is kind of what anticipating what I was, or at least telling you, if we do the treatment effects that I told you about, where I compare treatment versus just the category of stay at home, for the girls there are beneficial effects still, right? So this is the category, you got treatment. And for the people, what your outcome would have been had you stayed at home full time, okay? And the other alternative is you go to a center, and the centers are generally of low quality. So for the boys, for the girls, there's very strong, you're getting a very high number of outcomes. For the boys, you really couldn't reject 50-50. There really aren't so many outcomes. So there, it's interesting. And if I do the other alternative, well, I don't have it here, but if I do the other, which is going into the high quality versus low quality preschools, and that's what the alternatives are, there are very strong effects for boys now. I almost reversed this pattern. For boys, there are huge effects. Yes?
All disadvantaged kids coming from disadvantaged families, but it might be that those who stay at home coming for, better families, relatively speaking.
Well, we actually control for that. Yes, they are all disadvantaged, but there's variation of what disadvantage is. And in all these statistics, we're actually conditioning on the variation. So there are single-parent families, and there are two-parent families, predominantly single-parent families. We do have measures of mother's education, for example. So we have measures of parental characteristics. So this B set is not just kind of defining this initial inclusion sample, but we're adjusting the treatment effects for that variation. There still could be variation I'm missing, though. So.
Yeah, but maybe those who decide to have their kids at home versus those who send them to, work.
No, we didn't. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and there is some weak evidence that there's sorting of that type, but it's not so strong. That the more advantaged parents might be keeping their kids at home, for example. I think this is better environment than my going to a home. But I don't have anything.
Isn't this result with boys a striking negative result for your general?
Yeah. No. Well, yes. Well, yes, but it's also a statement about what's the benefit, what's the effect on boys of putting them in low-quality centers. This is, implicitly we're making that comparison, isn't it? So we're saying and that's one issue that's actually potentially important. It's not just child care, it's quality child care. And so indirectly, I think I can make an inference, right, that high quality could have some effect, right? But if the low quality program, I'm getting low quality alternatives, I'm getting a benefit. I will, is that? Yeah. Okay, fine, okay. So there's gender. So these are the main findings. I explained it. But there is a little literature, that actually by Baker and his co-author, and recently by Kotlenberg and Lehr, that low-quality childcare actually can harm children. You actually find negative effects on social and emotional skills. So it's consistent, at least, and the effects are always found for boys. Boys are much less resilient than the girls. The little girls somehow can cope with being put in a low-quality childcare. Boys are more maybe needy at that age, or less able to cope with the absent mother.
Do they also check the parents' effect?
The parents' effect? What do you mean?
Do the mothers do just as well, whether the kids are in a good environment or a bad one?
Well, the mothers do well because getting child care, but no, no, I haven't looked at that. I don't know that. It's maybe. You think there would be anxiety of the mother thinking, I put my kid in a low-quality center, and as a result, on the job all day, I'm thinking, is my child care worker abusing my child? No, that's possible, logically.
Or hypothetically, perhaps, the mothers who are learning how to take better care of their kids are also not working as hard. So you could do it.
Good. No, I haven't looked at that. That's an interesting idea. So anyway, what I'm really talking about, and now I have not much time, right?
Half an hour.
Half an hour?
But take whatever you
Okay, whatever. Okay, fine. Wait, is that clock right? Oh, my watch isn't. Okay, fine. That's why I keep asking. So this is what I want to do, and this is where I use the econometrics in a way that I think is unusual or useful, I think. So what we want to consider is looking at valid predictions, at least out of sample age. So what we have in life cycle effects, and so it's challenging, to put it mildly. So let me just go through the ingredients. But I already told you the main idea. We're going to supplement this with life cycle profiles from other longitudinal data sources. But they're typically older sources. So we're going to have to account for that. And so formally, if you're familiar with these empirical Bayes methods, we're combining multiple samples. And we're basically we're weighting the data, and we're using information across samples. And conditioning. And of course, there's an issue to put these samples together. You have to be very careful using the same constructs and the same set of conditioning variables, that they're defined appropriately. So here's the structural issue. There's no direct source of information on future outcomes from the experiment. So there are two ways to say it. One is to say, see, I'm a real scientist. I'm not going to tell you what the effects are, because I don't know. And I'll tell you that right now. But I'm going to still go ahead and try to do something. But I'm going to tell you under what conditions I think I can plausibly do it. So the idea is to use post-sample life cycle benefits using synthetic cohorts. That's been an old idea. Jacob Mincer used that long ago in making forecasts of life cycle earnings. Fitting a life cycle earnings profile from a cross-section is basically using synthetic cohorts. So the notion is to get groups comparable to the experimental baselines that aren't exposed to treatment. But now there's an actually analytical question. This is an old question in biostatistics. And there's a whole literature on what are called surrogate markers. And the surrogate marker literature is a literature that basically says, look, I have some measure of a life cycle outcome, and from some other data I can tell you what this measure does and how it predicts outcomes, but from some other auxiliary data set. So we're in the same spirit as that. But there is something that's a little bit different. Namely, the relationships that we fit in the non-experimental samples are fundamentally, or could be, very different from the experimental samples, right? And the reason is we have experimental variation that's not there in the non-experimental samples. So we have this example of the education-income relationship. So the experiment would give us something like an ability constant relationship. I mean, we can control for that. We have measures of it, we can do it. Non-experimental data, we may have to control for the unobservables. So there really is an issue about aligning these samples. The stochastic relationship between the measured variables, which we call inputs, and the final outputs could be different in the non-experimental sample than the experimental sample, precisely because we have experimental variation. We know that, this is a standard problem. I hope it's a standard problem, considered now a standard problem, and that is when we do an experiment, we get treatment effects for the outcomes. We get true treatment effects for the inputs. We don't get treatment effects for the inputs on the outputs. And the reason is the experiment could have changed some unobserved variables that could affect the output. So what we're doing is then we're getting some ingredients. So as I say, we're getting the inputs for the production functions. We can say how much it changed the observed inputs. We can also say how much the experiment changed the outcomes. But using it directly, you need some supplement. You need some non-experimental method or methods to adjust for the fact that the unobservables have also been changed by the experiment. And that's just not intrinsic to the experiment. So that's a limit for experiments. People think, you get randomized trials, you're going to be able to answer these questions. It's a fundamentally different relationship. So what do we need? So I'm going to talk about structural forecasting, and I'll go over this relatively quickly. The notation can be a little ugly, but the idea is very simple-minded. And first of all, common variables, common supports, and common stochastic processes. I mean, this may sound like an obvious list, but it's not. And they're actually, these are relatively demanding. But at least over certain subsets of the sample, these are testable restrictions. And I'll show you how we do that. So I want to look at this. I already explained that. So the question is, so here's the key assumption, that the effect of treatment on outcomes is going to be operating through its effect on inputs, creating outputs. Now you think about it for a second. What I'm really doing, here I have a production function, y equals some f, say, of x. These are some inputs here, and then maybe some epsilon, okay? And so what I'm going to suggest is that if I look at a treatment effect, and we can do this for y1, let's say that's x1, and here's y0 equals f, and I could even have this too, right? Sorry, f1. So this function may be different for the treatment group. The map between inputs and outputs could differ between treatment and control group. So this is f0, x0, and here's epsilon 1, and here's epsilon 0. So basically, the experiment can change the map, and it can change the inputs. And I'm going to test that. I'm going to claim that the experiment didn't change the map, and it's operating only through the inputs. And it's testable over that range of data where between 0 and what I called A star, the observed sample ranges. But that's a very radical hypothesis. If you think about it de novo, without any knowledge, there's no reason necessarily to say you don't change the map. And it secondly depends on exactly what the inputs are, right? And so if I have really bad inputs, that's going to show up as basically different production functions. So I'll make that more precise in a second. So basically we're going to say that, I guess if I actually say it, what I'm going to say is it's the same f, and that I can control for those shifts in the epsilon. That's the boldness. And in that, what does that mean that I can do? If I have inputs like this, and I can get an idea of what that structural relationship is, then what I can do is forecast out of sample. And I can actually fit some relationship like this in the non-experimental samples. So I don't have to just make up this function. You know, what I could have done is also superscripted this by age, but I dropped that. But I could allow an age-specific function, but it would be common. But the key assumption is it's common between the treatment and the control. And that's a strong medicine. So I'm not saying that follows from any logical, but it is empirically valid, and it gives us the key, at least one way to imagine doing it. So here's where the ugliness comes in. You may have thought it had already arrived, but anyway, here's the causal model. So the treatment, here's the same function here. I'm writing in an additively separable way. D stands for treatment and control. So D lives in 0, 1. Same notation, the lowercase d. We have two different samples. So K is going to be E or N, experimental, non-experimental. And there could be a N subscripted, N1, N2, and N3, different ages, and then different outcomes. So J, K, N. So this is going to be the very general setup. And I'm going to end up telling you, I want to show evidence that the D superscript isn't needed. And that's going to be the key assumption. And that I can also control for these. Okay? And there's where you may strongly disagree with me, and I might even agree with you. So this is what I would call a policy invariant structural function. Now, so then we have the inputs here, and then the rest of it is just kind of, so if you know the superscripts refer to the D's, subscripts are ages, which sample you're in, and which outcome we're studying. That's basically it. So it's ugly, and then that's the switching regression framework, so we can do this. And so I'm going to skip over these assumptions because I verbally summarized this. This is just a formal way to say the best assumption for me would be to say the absence of cohort and time effects within the samples I'm using. That's all this says. I mean, I could go through and explain all. This is a very kind of minimal set of conditions where I don't have to do any adjustment. But failing assumption 1, and I believe we actually do fail it because of the non-stationarity of the earnings function data in the US, that we need to adjust for the cohort effect. So that goes without saying. I said it already, so I'll just not go over it. The support conditions are basically saying that we want the non-experimental support to include the experimental support. So we want to be able to at least consider exactly over what range. So we can basically talk about the experiment is going to have a whole support. And the bite on that is actually empirical. I can test this, actually. This is testable, right? As long as I stay below age 34. That's just data. This is experimental data. It's not experimental data. I can literally test this. I can look at the supports in the sample. But obviously, beyond A star, I can't. And so that's where the assumption is coming in. So it's partially testable. We actually test that, but I'm not going to. And so the question is, what are the conditions for using the experiment? Well, I mean, these are the kind of conditions you see in the biostatistics literature, and they're very strong. And it's basically an assumption about F is the CDF, the cumulative distribution function for these outcomes conditional on these background variables. And it's really saying, age, it should be also age by age. These are vectors, so it includes the ages. But what it's basically saying is these joint distributions are the same. But if I'm in the business of looking only at benefit-cost ratios, I have a very simple linear function, right? It's just the difference between treatment and control. And I'm going to monetize those. So it's really a simple linear function. And I don't need that. I can get by with an assumption on means, but actually I can get by with an even stronger, weaker assumption, which is an assumption on the treatment effects. I don't even need to align the means. I just have to make sure that I align the differences. And this is something that I can test. I can actually compute this in the experimental sample. And I can compute this in the non-experimental sample as well, if I can actually adjust for the input differences. So the program is going to change ability of children. I have an experimental, I know what the effective ability is on earnings. I'm going to account for that. I can test at age A less than A star whether that's true. So basically what we're going to do is we test and we do not reject. Let me just say that. I am saying exogeneity and the epsilon, this is a strong assumption. We don't need it. I mean, we can get by if we have valid instruments or some other method of controlling. That's not required. So it's not essential, and empirically, the exogeneity question is less important, at least when we try different econometric ways to approach this. So I won't show you all these, but I can. That's why the slides were so long. These appendices have hundreds of tables, so you can read that at your... But this is the key assumption, which is now just formally stated, but it's the same point, that the structural function operates commonly. So that's basically erasing the superscripts in this display. So that to me was a key assumption. It allows me to connect the experimental sample and the non-experimental sample. And this is exactly the idea of structural invariance that goes back to Frisch, this 1938 paper on exogeneity by Frisch. Okay? So basically, this is a summary of what I just said. And these are the testable implications. So I can literally test whether or not these means are different or the treatment effects are different. And I can construct treatment effects even within the non-experimental sample. I can construct, or if I know the inputs, I can find what the outputs would be. So anyway, at this point, I would refer you to the paper. We have a lot of tests, and you can take a look at it. Question? Yeah.
To clarify, it
Yeah.
comes to this distinction observables and unobservables. So
Yes.
if you had some unobservables in those functions, that might violate.
Absolutely, and that it would change.
Analysis, right?
Exactly. No, exactly. Or if the unobservable, well, you have to be careful. It depends on whether those unobservables are exogenous with respect to these x's. You know, I wrote down a non-separable form, but what we did here in these slides was separable. So that already makes it easier. But I'm also arguing that really doesn't turn out empirically to be important. But you're right. You're at the mercy. This is true, generally. This assumption is at the mercy of the quality of the inputs you have. It's not going to be generally true. If I have very crude census data, I don't really have the inputs, how could I tell you? The experiment we know is raising ability of kids. It's changing their social and emotional skills. Those are inputs into these treatment effects. And if we don't measure them, then it's going to look like totally, we have some very crude inputs. Then we look like structural invariance, and then I'm down the drain, unless I can somehow control for those emitted variables. And that we get into standard simultaneous equations type problem. I'm not saying it's easy to solve because it's a standard problem. It's a tough solution. So anyway, so we look at these tests, and we can actually see how well we look at the control group and the synthetic control group, and there really is a lot of overlap, especially for the women, a little less so for the men, but there's a lot of overlap in the supports. So then basically all I'm done is summarize everything. I won't have to go over it. And this is like the 5-step procedure, but I've already told you that. And this is an example of what we're doing here in this study. So, I mean, this, by the way, if you're familiar with life cycle earnings profiles, this looks very bizarre. But it's actually this is a low-income population. The kids themselves, even though there's a treatment effect that's positive, you're not getting these kids out of what essentially is a relatively low-income status. So this hump-shaped profile, which looks very bizarre, notice the hump is like peaking at 40, is actually something that's been found in many US data sets. Blundell also has found it in some data sets. So actually, we're actually predicting something at least that looks like what's found in the empirical literature. So,
is this like early retirement or something?
Well, it's disability, it's retirement of a form. I mean, in the US, we have this whole notion of groups of people getting onto disability very early and essentially leaving the labor force. So it's a kind of retirement. Yeah. Some of them go to jail. That's another form of retirement. So yes, no, it's a different growth. And then it turns out, I'll just skip past this, that if we just did something very crude, and this is like undermining everything I just told you, and just kind of matched on observable X, we get results that are actually quite similar. You can think of that as like a test for exogeneity. We can go through, but so anyway, I won't go through that. So let me talk about, so I have now, what, 10 minutes or 15? Okay, good, actually, I can finish. I'm amazed that people are sitting here. I mean, I think it's probably a captive audience, but that's okay. So there's some.
Such a program.
What's that?
We have patients.
You have patience?
We were in such a program.
Ah, so your non-cognitive skills were, okay. You learned to listen to boring lectures, good. So Future of America model is this model developed by Goldman and his associates at USC. And it's what's called, it's a dynamic competing risks model. So what we can do is we have measures of health outcomes at 34. So how can you forecast life cycle health from age 34 measures? There is some way to do that, but it required a challenge. I thought that I could get something off the shelf from the epidemiologist. Amazingly, the only person I found doing this was Goldman and his group. No epidemiologist is doing it. But let me show you why I got interested in health. This is a finding we had in this science paper, another science paper. And what we did is the treatment and control group, at age 34, the treatment group has much lower systolic blood pressure, much lower diastolic blood pressure. These are the treatment effects. The small sample, this is again, these are the, in that paper we also were using just permutation inference. Hypertension, lower hypertension, good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, ordered in the right direction. So what we find is much less metabolic syndrome, and that's a precursor for diabetes. So these people look pretty healthy, but it's only 35. So what do we do? Now this is where things get somewhat interesting. Oops. Okay. So what we're doing is we're estimating competing risks model. So what we're doing is estimating an age by age health state transition matrix. And we're using the panel survey of income dynamics linked with other data sources. I don't know if there are any health economists here or look at the US, but you do. Okay, fine. So there's this MEP study, right? Many people think it's awful, so I don't know if it's the only thing I have.
Some good things came out of it.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, no, McCurdy thinks there are a lot of issues. So what we're doing then, let me just show you. So we have multiple data sets, and then it doesn't show here, but we link on at age 50. So we have to take people from 35 to 50 using some standard panel data sets, and then we want to go from age 50 on to the rest of your life. We can use the Health and Retirement Survey, which actually does start sampling people at age 50 and has very detailed data on health. So this is the kind of transition matrix we're talking about. And so literally, I mean, I thought you would have this. So this is like if you have these risk factors, how you can transfer. So we map the risk factors back to those clinical indicators taken by doctors, and then we can actually go forward and make projections. So we can make age by age projections, and we can account for dependence. So it's also like a first order Markov, but with heterogeneity. And then we can also test second order Markov, doesn't change things so much. So this is the kind of idea, just generally speaking, but this by itself is a whole separate topic, and there is a lot of work on this, but nonetheless we can do it. But we find very strong effects in what are in the so-called quality adjusted life years for both males and females, especially for males. And that's interesting. This is where it's gender specific. The health effects are found much more for men than for women. Crime, well, you know, here what we do, we have a huge discussion of this, and there's a big literature in criminology and in economics of crime and punishment trying to quantify what the costs of crime are. And there's a lot of conjecture involved in exactly, you know, I can measure prison years, the cost of putting somebody in prison, the number of resources lost. What's the value of a murder? You know, what's the damage caused by a rape and so forth? There are estimates that are made, but they range, and we test the sensitivity. It gets to the question of what's the value of a life? What value do you assign on that? And then there are intermediate values about what the medical costs are. We do know that from the MEP study, right? That study will tell you what the dollar costs are of a given condition at a given age. So if you have a heart attack at age 45, what the dollar costs would be. So we can quantify that. But that's the Goldman component here. So we can count arrests and sentences, construct predictions, and so forth. So we have a very extensive sensitivity analysis because this is controversial. When you start valuing lives, the literature goes from very small values to millions of dollars a year. And surprisingly, I'll show you what happens when we drop the whole crime module because it's so sensitive. And then there's education. So let me just conclude by putting it all together. This is what I'm leading up to. This is my punchline. I showed you the punchline. So the yearly cost of the program is close to 18,500. So that's what I was saying, close to 20,000 a year. That's pretty high. So many people look at this and say, this is nuts. We can't afford that. And maybe they can't. But, and so we actually have good estimates. These are marginal costs of participants. They're mostly labor costs. And the people in this program are largely qualified teachers. So these are people who at least have 2-year degrees at associate degrees, and some of them have 4-year degrees. So we find what their salaries are, and we have measures of the actual salaries, not only of their payments, but we actually know. And then there's also a way to put value on the facilities, the rental cost, providing capital, housing the students, young kids. So this is the table I showed you. So the quantification leads us to this particular result. This is what I was telling you about before, though, and this is answering your question about 20 minutes ago. So now, given the way, and this is where there's conjecture here, right? Because I'm comparing the males. Treatment versus the next best is this whole block. I mean, that's the late type estimate that comes from the experiment. These other benefits are treatment versus, and in this case here, stay at home. So if you look at it, these are for boys now. Treatment, stay at home, the benefits are much less. Okay? And actually, they're not statistically significant. That's kind of consistent with what I was showing on the benefits, that combining function. But if I look at treatment versus go to these preschools, which are basically of low quality. Question? You have a question? You're shaking your head in disbelief? What? Go ahead. Oh, what's written? Well, me going too fast and so forth. So what this is these are the components of the cost-benefit analysis. So I can break it up. You know, the cost-benefit function is an additive. It's additive in these components, right? So I'm telling you how much I gain from, this is total, how much I get from the labor income of participants, how much I get from the mother's income that she gets, and I may not want to count that depending on how I think the labor market's working. This is the benefit in terms of crime reduction. And you notice this thing is going negative for at home. It's better to stay at home, that's what it's saying. And then this is the quality of life. And that's the medical costs. And we can break it out more finely. I'll show you some more refined categories. Is that clear? Question? Yeah, please.
If I understand the graph, it means that if the only alternative was to stay at home,
yeah,
then the cost is pretty much there.
Well, not the only. See, you're restricting the choice set. What I'm doing is I'm saying I have this choice set, and if I stay at home versus treatment. So it's not if I have the only. So yes, I guess you're right. If I really restricted the choice set to one element, namely staying at home, yes, that's what it is. But I'm not estimating it quite that way because I have a lot of other choices. I'm saying this compared to that alternative. So it's just taking treatment versus alternative 1, alternative 2, and so forth. Here are the only two alternatives, stay at home or go to. And so that's the benefit. That's the question. Does that answer your question? Yeah. They have alternatives. They can stay at home and be raised by other relatives. It's not, they can work. No, staying at home does not mean they stay with the mother. They stay in the home environment. And some of these families are very, like extended families. So the grandmother would actually be taking care of the kid or the aunt.
Those who stay at home.
Correct. And that's where it gets conjectural, because now I actually have to account for that decision. I called it V equals 1 or not. And that's where I'm saying I'm going to use some non-experimental method. And that's why if you're a hardcore experimentalist, you'd say, I believe the black blocks, but I don't believe these sub-blocks. And you're perfectly entitled to that opinion. I think I do believe these sub-blocks, but there are stronger assumptions being made to get them. So, yeah, question, yeah.
But so do you think that the stay at home versus the bad preschools are the same, like in my interpretation, that's just a selection issue, like the better families.
Well, but we were trying to
extended family that was going to help them out.
exactly. But see, what that comes down to, if I translate it back into what I was saying, is you don't believe that I have control for selection adequately by modeling the V, and that could well be true. There could be some additional. Maybe I just screwed up completely in adjusting for V, but we do make an attempt to remember. V is do I go stay at home or use the alternative?
So. You know what this picture would look like without your adjustment?
I do, but it is somewhat different. The adjustment makes a difference, but I don't know exactly, Dan. It's a good question. I'll send you a graph next week if you really want to see it. Now, we have the data to do it. I just haven't, I don't know. That's a very good question. I honestly don't know. Okay, so is that clear? I mean, and for women, or for the girls, I should say, they're all little kids here, you're getting kind of a different result. The girls are actually seen to be benefiting, if anything, relative to staying at home. Very interesting, I think. And as I say, there was a conference at Chicago a few weeks ago, not just by economists, but psychologists and so forth. There's a whole literature about the fact that little boys are very vulnerable. You know, we have all these discussions about men versus women and what the issues are, but there are also a lot of problems with boys and a lot of problems with girls. And so there are problems. But little boys seem to be very vulnerable, especially disadvantaged boys. And they really do seem to be needing some kind of attention. This is my graph now. Maybe it's clear what I was saying. I put this up before. This is this heart-shaped region. And the way to read it is this is the rate of return, and this is the benefit-cost analysis if I only look at crime. You know, and then if I only look at health, and then if I look at health and crime together, and then if I look at health and crime and parental income together, and then if I look at all these things together.
This is pulled from males and females together?
Together for this one, and we can break it out by gender, yes. Here, just as, yes, this is putting both together. And for females, some of these components would be 0, or very, very small, like the crime component. Now, I'll show you. This is doing what you're doing, but now, see, this is much better, I think. These graphs, these figures are very visual. You think you understand them. This looks very boring, but this does answer your question.
This is showing the money.
It's showing the dollar values, exactly. But it also is giving you the rate of return. If you look at the top of the table, see, it gives you the net present value and the internal rates of return. So what this is doing is looking at the calculations when I get rid of each component. This is getting rid of one component at a time and seeing what survives. So you can see, you can go down and ask, well, what's robust and what's not? And they're not all robust, there's no question. But look, I was telling you about crime. So suppose I get rid of crime and I look at the male results, okay? Then I'm still finding that I'm getting a substantial outcome, even without counting crime. So that's what this table's saying. So so what I'm doing here is just reporting in a graphical way the estimates that we came by these different procedures. It's not like a sampling distribution. It's a distribution of all the different ways we calculated these things and kind of putting in a graphical form. And it shows what the range of estimates is. And, you know, it's much better, more concentrated away from 0 for men than for women, but it's still, we're finding these are the estimates of the rate of return, higher for men than women, and net present value and so forth. So I'm getting close to, I just wanted to make one calculation. In the recent literature, there's a nice paper by Klein and Walters. It was just published in the QJE about looking at this substitution bias question. I mean, they looked at Head Start, and they account for the fact that Head Start participants randomized into Head Start or out of Head Start have alternatives. It turns out some of the alternatives for a Head Start control group are other Head Start programs. Head Start is local, so you can literally be in one neighborhood and then use the Head Start in another neighborhood. So when people said that the experimental evaluation of Head Start showed no effect, they didn't realize they were comparing Head Start with Head Start. And of course, there shouldn't be an effect. But it's much more simple. It's basically they're fitting a selection model and adjusting for that. But now the question is, they only get early years. They get a test score gain, but they can't follow the kids very far. So without getting in, they're following some earlier work by Chetty, but I've run out of time, so I'll just show you that when we calculate, when you start using these methods, using sort of Klein and Walter's method, the benefit cost method, what we would find to be 1.09. But that would be stopping at age 27. It would be only looking at labor income. If we actually go even to age 34, where we actually have data, so this is still staying within the sample, but looking at all the benefits, we get 2.01. You'll notice if we only look at labor income, it actually falls. That's interesting because there are additional costs invoked. Anyway, that's another little footnote story. If we look now over the whole lifetime using our projection, but just looking at labor income, we get 1.55. But if we look at this number here, we're going to get 6.29. We're looking at all measures. So this is, so what I'm suggesting is that there are substantial benefits. So this is all this is saying. So let me just summarize. So we have experiments, and I think they're great. I'm not attacking experiments. I'm not attacking anybody. I'm attacking a problem, though. So what we do is you take this study, and what we do is say, okay, we can supplement the information from it. If we do it in an honest way, we can find, yes, we get more benefits, we can find more things, and we can look at this program in multiple ways and see how much they align with each other. And here I think the structural analysis is really complementing what we get from the experiment. And it's true that we're making statements. Some of them are at least partially testable. And so we can at least put people's fears to rest, or at least partially put them to rest by looking at that data. But I would argue that this idea of structural invariance, strong assumption, testable up to A star, is something that can help us, at least in some cases. So I just don't want to summarize. So I'll go back. I'll go back to the blind man and the elephant. And this is now the blinders removed. I actually showed you this before. But what it is, yeah, we have looked at this in multiple ways. And there are gender differences. And it is expensive. It works for boys and girls, but in different dimensions. And there's rate of return if we look at all the components. So in some sense, there is agreement. And I think it's reassuring that we find with different ways of looking at the treatment effects, combining functions versus internal rates of return versus step-down tables, we find essentially the same, we come to essentially the same conclusion. So I'll stop. Thank you very much.